to the virtual stage Mariah Hay. Mariah is the Chief Experience Officer at Help Scout, where she leads engineering, design, and product management. And she spent her career teaching and advocating human-centered design, winning a couple awards along the way, including the Women Tech Award for Product Excellence in 2017. So very excited for her presentation on ethics in product design and how we, as human-centered designers, can drive ethical decision-making in our everyday work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mariah Hay, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm the Chief Experience Officer currently at Help Scout, and previously had served as VP of Product at Pluralsight, among other companies. And one thing you should know about me is I'm probably the biggest human-centered design nerd that you will ever meet. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the context of ethics today. So I like to break down the profession of design and digital development into two things. So first, we are problem finders, and second, we're problem solvers. And the reason I put these two together is because they're equally important. Knowing how to find the right problem to solve is crucial to being able to solve the right problems for customers. Now, I personally think that we have the best job in the world. The sheer impact of what we do when we solve a problem and we're able to release a feature and impact millions of humans in maybe a matter of minutes, we might possibly have the most powerful jobs in the world, in the history of the world. It can be really frightening if you think about it. And actually, let's do that. Let's think about that together, because we are problem finders and problem solvers. But if we aren't very careful, we can also become problem creators. And when people with powerful jobs like us are problem creators, it can be very dangerous. Which brings me to the topic of our talk today. With great power comes great responsibility, which is why it's crucial for us to understand ethics in the context of product. So today, we're going to talk about what ethics are, what creating problems look like. I'm going to share a little case study. I'm going to talk about how it's a competitive advantage to pay attention to human-centered design and ethics, and also talk about how you can avoid becoming a problem creator. So let's start out with ethics. What exactly are ethics? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines ethics as the discipline of dealing with what is good or bad with moral duty and obligation. And these ethical principles that we humans create are almost always governed or influenced by the larger group to which we associate ourselves. Simply put, it's how you and I determine right from wrong, depending on who our professional and social circles are. Now, as far back as the 5th century, professional groups have always crafted their own ethical codes, standards to which they held themselves and they held others in their professions to. The medical profession was the first, publishing Formula Comatos Architecturum. It required that physicians widen and deepen their knowledge through consulting with other physicians instead of keeping their best practices secret. They realized that when they shared knowledge with each other, they could improve outcomes and provide the best possible care to their patients. And by the 18th and 19th century, the industry was firmly operating as anti-competitive and guild-like in nature, so that knowledge could be shared, and that would be standard. So today, physicians place 4 ethical principles at the core of everything they do. The first is respect for autonomy, which means the patient has the right to refuse and choose their treatment. The second is beneficence, which means a practitioner should always act in the best interest of the patient. The third is non-maleficence, not to be the cause of harm, and also utility. The treatment has to promote more good than harm. And the fourth is justice. Justice concerns the distribution of scarce health resources and the decision of who gets what treatment, leading into fairness and equity for all humans. Now, the medical industry is not the only industry with a lock on ethics. The engineering industry also values ethics so highly that in many engineering educational programs, they present the engineer a ring upon graduation to be worn on the pinky finger as a reminder of their moral, ethical, and professional commitment based on a cautionary tale. Now, as the story goes, the ring ceremony was created after the Quebec Bridge linking Winnipeg to Moncton on the Transcontinental Railway failed twice in close succession, killing a total of 85 people in the early 1900s. The collapse of this bridge led to the tradition of the Iron Ring to symbolize the humility and fallibility of engineers and their moral and ethical duty. It might be obvious as to why ethics have become a cornerstone for these disciplines. The consequence of failure in each mean disability or death to the people that they're serving, which to most humans are fairly unacceptable outcomes. But what about when the consequences aren't so black and white? What happens when we problem finders and problem solvers end up creating problems for the consumers of our solutions? And what are our ethical responsibilities? Alex Kearns was a 20-year-old college student who traded options on Robinhood. According to his family, in June 2020, Alex made a series of trades and his app interface led him to believe that he owed over $730,000. He desperately attempted to reach out to Robinhood customer support, and when his outreach went unanswered, he took his own life. The family accused the startup in a lawsuit of luring inexperienced investors to take big risks in sophisticated financial instruments without providing the necessary customer support and investment guidance. Robinhood settled the wrongful death lawsuit in July 2021 this year, and they disclosed the settlement in its IPO filing, although the terms were not disclosed. Kearns' death was cited by Wall Street's self-regulating in a record-setting penalty imposed on Robinhood for harming investors. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority accused Robinhood of systemic supervisory failures and giving customers false or misleading information. They, quote unquote, failed to exercise due diligence before approving customers' options to trade. Now, if this was your design, if this was your team, your work, what would you do? In September 2015, the EPA issued a notice of violation of the Clean Air Act to Volkswagen Group. The agency had found that Volkswagen had intentionally programmed their turbocharged direct injection, TDI, diesel engines to activate their emissions controls only during laboratory emissions testing, which caused the vehicle's nitrogen oxide output to meet the US standards during the testing, but emit up to 40 times in the real world. Now, Volkswagen deployed the software in about 11 million cars worldwide, and the company pled guilty to charges resulting in a decline in its stock price. The resignation of CEO Martin Winterkorn, who was also charged with fraud and conspiracy by US courts in May 2018. As for the engineer that designed the software, James Lang, he also was charged with violating the Clean Air Act and received 40 months in prison and was fined $200,000. And his boss, the general manager of engineering and emissions, will spend 7 years in prison and pay fines upwards of $400,000. The environmental impact that Volkswagen had is kind of hard to measure, but nitrogen oxide melts the ozone layer and it creates smog and deteriorates air quality for millions of people that suffer all sorts of health issues, especially children. And this creates long-term and permanent damage. So I challenge you to think about this for a minute. If you were asked to design this unlawful feature by your CEO, what would you do? And in 2016, Cambridge Analytica, a data analytics firm, used personal information harvested from more than 50 million Facebook profiles without the permission of the users in order to build a system that could target voters with personalized content in order to influence their cultural beliefs and alter their voting behavior based on their psychological profile. Christopher Wiley helped build the algorithm.
My name is Christopher Wiley. I'm a data scientist, and I helped set up Cambridge Analytica. It's incorrect to call Cambridge Analytica a purely sort of data science company or an algorithm, company. It is a full-service propaganda machine. If you can control all of the streams of information around your opponent, you can influence how they perceive that battle space, and you can then influence how they're going to behave and react.
How do you feel about your own involvement in this now? I mean, do you feel responsible for what happened?
Yeah, I do. I do feel responsible for it. It's something that I regret. And that's partly why I'm here talking to you, so that I can talk to, so that people can know about what this company does, what this company is. Throughout history, you have examples of grossly unethical experiments.
Is that what this was?
I think that, yes, it was a grossly unethical experiment, because you are playing with an entire country, the psychology of an entire country, without their consent or awareness. And not only are you playing with the psychology of an entire nation, you're playing with the psychology of an entire nation in the context of the democratic process.
The work that Christopher and Cambridge Analytica were doing had far-reaching societal impact, manipulating the general public to influence policy, human protections, and legitimate representation. If you were asked to design a system like this, or you found the work you were doing would be used in this way, what would you do? The problems we are creating as an industry for the general public that we serve are originating from lack of ethical accountability. In the example of Robinhood, there's negligence. It was created and delivered without understanding the problems to be solved or how what it created truly impacts those that relied on it. There's an obvious lack of skill and understanding, and because of that, somebody has died. In the example of the Volkswagen emission scandal, the ethical culprit is blatant disregard for our laws, from the CEO the whole way down to the developer. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they made the decision to break the laws put in place that protect the very families that they sell their cars to. And because of that, people are sicker. And in the case of Cambridge Analytica, it was a complete lack of empathy for those it would impact. And because of that, entire populations are being manipulated in ways that prevent them from understanding truth and reality so they can participate in a process meant to govern our society. And in 2014, Pluralsight acquired a company. This company was called Smarterer, and Smarterer had developed a way to assess skills quickly and effectively. Being a learning platform, Pluralsight had a vision for integrating so that they could quickly assess a learner's skills and tell them what courses to watch in order to improve that skill. We launched assessments in 2016, and the feature immediately started to gain traction. So what assessments was within 20 to 25 questions, Pluralsight could assess and predict proficiency of a learner at a topic level within a skill. The learners loved it because it was able to show them how proficient they were in a subject and where to start on a rather intimidating learning path. And they also didn't waste time watching courses that they were already proficient in. Learners didn't object to us gathering this data about them because it was bringing them direct value. And they didn't mind us keeping it because we were able to surface progress over time so that they could benchmark themselves and track their own learning. Because Pluralsight not only sells licenses to users, they also sell them to companies who in turn make them available for their employees. We then turned our attention to what the company would see when an employee on their plan started to take an assessment. Now, this is when stuff started to get tricky because we started asking questions like, what would the employee be comfortable with us sharing? How would they feel about it? Would it discourage or encourage them to take an assessment? What would their employer do with the information? Now, I'm really proud of the team for thinking about it this way because in the back of their minds, they were thinking about what I consider the first ethical tenet of product development, which is don't weaponize the product. We know people that use our product to learn tech skills, they're not stupid. And if we use their information in a sneaky way or a way that could potentially be used against them, they're going to stop using it. And then we as a product team have failed to solve our learner's problem, which is helping our learner to learn a skill. In order to make sure that we didn't weaponize the product consciously or even by accident, the product team created and executed a research plan to get answers to all of the questions that they were asking. This included what behavioral metrics they wanted to look for, what the metrics should look like if they have created a positive outcome. And it also included a few different forms of qualitative and quantitative research, like surveys to understand the breadth of reaction at scale, one-on-one interviews to do deep dives into the why behind the patterns the team had uncovered through those surveys, which brings me to the second ethical non-negotiable that the team stood behind, which is find your blind spots. For this team, the blind spots were twofold. First, the team needed to make sure that they completely understood the downstream impact of what they were creating, both for customers and for Pluralsight. The second is that they went to other practitioners within the organization, people who they could get a second opinion from on the way they were tackling this work, to make sure that they removed as much bias as possible and were really rigorous in their approach. Because as practitioners, we're just humans with a limited connection of knowledge. Much like medical practitioners are ethically required to collaborate with one another, my team was taking the same approach. The team then pulled the most important insights that became guide rails for designing the new experience. Our learners feared being ranked against their peers, but they wanted to have conversations around opportunities for professional development with their leaders. They were concerned about their scores affecting their promotions and raises, but they were proud of their skills and they wanted to showcase them. After going and figuring out all of the potential problems with sharing their data, the team designed an experience that our learners were comfortable with, which is sharing their proficiency level, not the actual score. The page on the right is what the employer sees when they look at the analytics on a particular employee who was learning on the platform. It shows the learner's skills and provides enough information for conversation around professional development without showing the data that employees feared would be used in a way that could be punitive. And when we released the analytics featured for companies to view the data, there were no surprises, no negative assessments, no negative changes to the assessments being used or learning behavior. So we had succeeded in creating value and we didn't weaponize the product. Shortly after we released the features, we started getting feedback from companies about how they envisioned using this type of technology. Among those inquiries were use assessments to assess candidates before they hire them, tie assessment performance to pay increases, or require employees to take assessments. All of these requests were companies imagining solutions for something that is particularly painful for them, truly understanding the skills of those that they were hiring, and that working from that so they could make business decisions. But there was a big problem with these suggestions. The way they suggested solving their problems weaponized our product. So instead, we dug deeper with the learners within companies that we serve to truly understand all of their pain points and look for ones that we could solve that didn't create any problems for our learners. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment to mention that the conscious decision to not add these suggestions into a feature backlog and stop and consider the implications is a perfect example of proactive, accountable ethics. I mean, it would be so easy to shrug our shoulders and say, that's what our customers want. That's what sales is telling us would sell. It would make money for the company. But, you know, it's not that big of a deal, but it is. It actually is a really big deal. And if we did it, we would become problem creators for our learners. It would disincentivize learning and ultimately end up blocking professional opportunity instead of encouraging it. Which brings me to the third ethical tenet that the team employed. They took 200% accountability for what they created, and they were 100% responsible for themselves and 100% responsible for those around them. They didn't just take feedback at face value and blindly build the next thing. They claimed accountability for truly understanding this feedback and using it as a starting point for their next round of work. So we went on to use our knowledge of what companies struggle with to create better solutions that supported both their needs and the learners' needs in a healthy way. We created analytics so that leaders could see the competency ranges across groups, teams, and organizations so they could make critical decisions about hiring, changing tech stacks, and knowledge available for critical products. And in doing this, we also maintained the learner trust, giving them the best experience so they could continue to work on their skills, which made them even more valuable to the organizations they worked for. Making human-centered design decisions is in the ethical best interest of people. It's not just a practice that lets us sleep better at night. It's also a competitive advantage for your company in more ways than just the product. Ethics trickle into the DNA of your business culture, and they can create some pretty cool results. When we hold ourselves accountable, it creates trust, openness, respect, and integrity. Decisions are more clearly made and weighed based on the understanding of shared values, and teams can focus on collaborating around all of the best possible outcomes. Now, all of these will yield more productivity, effectiveness, happier employees, fewer politics, and a better bottom line. Operating on human-centered ethics pays dividends in both the near term and in long-term success. So now it is your turn to go and get an ethics conversation started with your team. Today is the right time for all of us to start considering what ethics should look like in our companies. In order to get started, I want to offer up 3 ethical principles to ensure that you are a great problem finder and problem solver and help you avoid being a problem creator. So first, find your blind spots. Be honest and aware of your personal abilities to practice, and make sure you completely understand problem finding and problem solving in the context of what you're working on. And don't move from one step to another until you are confident that you and your team have all of the information you need to do great work and make informed decisions. Second, don't weaponize the product. Make sure the solution or experience you are creating does not have any downstream negative impacts to anyone. Work to develop experiences that reduce negative consequences to society, such as threats to health, safety, and make everyday work and activities easier. And third, you are 200% accountable. You're 100% accountable for the things you do, and you are 100% accountable for those around you. And if you know there are blind spots or you see product weaponization happening, it's your personal responsibility not to let that happen. So I challenge each and every person in this room to follow these principles. Go cultivate ethical awareness. It is too easy to avoid, ignore, and pretend that the issues aren't there and will go away, because they won't. And because of what we do, it has the impact to kill people, make them sick, manipulate them, and remove opportunities for them to reach their full potential. What we make impacts millions of people, people like us, people who don't have the power that we have. The tech industry is booming. We have a choice of where we work, where we spend our time, energy, and expertise. So act with courage. The reality is that ethics are not a given. It is something that each of us must consciously decide to participate in. We need to think through our ethics now before we are faced with ethical choices. And it's not that companies are inherently unethical. It's just that they aren't people. And because they are not people, it is impossible for companies to have ethics, because the ethics start with us. They live in us, in the practitioner. It's doctors, not hospitals, that take the Hippocratic Oath. It's engineers, not their clients, that wear the iron ring. And for us, we powerful problem finders and problem solvers, we must make the ethical decisions and not be problem creators. So I leave you with this, the practitioner's oath of I will be 200% accountable, know my blind spots, and will not allow my product to be weaponized. I recommend you go and take this oath with your team, because with great power comes great responsibility. Thanks for your time today.
Mariah, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I love the idea of being problem finders and problem solvers and the responsibility with it. I think that's such a great way to look at it.
Yeah, I like to frame it like that too. I think that really contextualizes the impact that we can have if we're not careful.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to dive into some questions. And one thing that kind of has resonated with me a little bit is you gave some great examples of engineering and medicine. Why do you think the idea of ethics hasn't been formalized in design yet? It doesn't seem like it's ingrained yet as part of our culture, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, ethics is a funny thing. Like I had mentioned in the presentation, ethics takes it can take decades or centuries to really codify within an industry as groups of people start to establish what they believe is right and wrong. And tech is a fairly new industry when you really think about it. We're just kind of toddlers on our ethical legs right now. And industries typically are far ahead out in front of regulation from the government standpoint in every industry. So it's really up to us as an industry, both in finance and in tech, to be able to put those things in place. And, you know, tech is interesting too, because it isn't an industry onto its own. We show up in just about every other sub industry. So for example, somebody building a product for the medical industry should be upholding medical ethical standards, and same thing for finance with financial ethical standards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We definitely, we touch a lot of parts and places and people, so that can be challenging in a lot of ways. And I guess along the same lines, we have a question here. Could you speak more to how you were able to succeed in ethics conversations with sales and other product stakeholders when speed to market and profitability were foremost in their priorities?
Yeah. Well, all of the case studies that I shared today, I would say hurt the bottom lines of the companies. And so actually, by acting in an ethical, human-centered way, the profitability is going to be more sustainable long-term for a company. And even just from a PR standpoint, if you want to just put it down to brass tacks like that, which is kind of our quarter-to-quarter impact of our stock prices once we are public companies. And so from that perspective, if you want that longevity, it is important to not create problems. On the flip side, sales and other product stakeholders, that's a great question. So there's a couple different types of drivers when we make decisions around what we're going to build. If you have a product or experience leader worth their salt, they are hearing what is happening as far as win-loss data from sales and churn. They are hearing what's coming in from your customer support team. And they also have teams within their experience organizations. For me, the experience org is engineering, product management, and product design. Those are the disciplines that report up to me, and the cross-functional teams that are responsible for those decisions and the performance of what we sell in the end, like at the end of the day. And they're looking at the intersectionality between what is the best thing to build. Product ethics doesn't mean that you're turning a blind eye to the business. In fact, you're hyper-focusing on what is actually best for the customer, what their needs are, and how that intersects with the finances of business success and product market fit. And I would argue that you actually achieve better product market fit faster when you're being judicious about looking at these things in a rigorous way. From my experience, the longest cycle is the actual building of the product. I know there's this weird misnomer where people are like, we can't spend time on research. And I'm like, well, if you're building the wrong thing, aren't you just going to have to go rebuild it when you don't hit product market fit and get it out there? So I've actually had a lot of success with kind of that rigor early on. And I find that the product folks that do that kind of work actually get way out in front of the engineers in terms of workflow and volume. So I don't think that that argument really has a leg to stand on. So build a strong product management team with excellent qualitative and quantitative research skills, and you can't go wrong. Then you can also tell the story to sales and other stakeholders within the business and keep everybody aligned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like you want to, maybe it's a very, very short-term sacrifice, but even mid and long-term, it's definitely the right move from every perspective around. We have another question kind of, I think, evolving kind of around the same thing, kind of this idea of disruptor thinking and how it can be at odds with ethical thinking in tech, this idea of move fast and break things. Do you have any thoughts on that and kind of rectifying those two worlds? And I think you may have just addressed part of it.
That's a great question, and it does come up often. There's catchphrases in our industry like move fast and break things, but what that catchphrase actually means is try things and iterate, because you have to iterate into product market fit. And as you're doing this iteration, part of the work there is understanding these strong customer signals. And if you're paying attention to this, and like I mentioned in the presentation, the first thing that I would recommend people to do is be honest about your skills within the company. Actually, do you have people on your team that can move fast and break things, which is the iterating and understanding how things are landing with customers. And part of that is keeping an eye on are you helping customers or hurting customers? And if you're hurting customers, you can be a disruptor all day long, but you're not going to be a disruptor for very long. So as a company, because somebody that isn't hurting customers will be able to come along and do it better. And you're starting to see, I think one of a good example of that was looking at Uber and Lyft and how they were kind of jostling for kind of being the number one in the market. And Uber kind of made some mistakes ethically, both within their product and how putting women at risk, and then also kind of not treating female employees in a way that was very tenable for most of them. And so they kind of developed this negative brand, and you saw a lot of people move over towards Lyft. So ultimately, like, unethical practices both within the company and what was showing up in their product was a disservice to the bottom line of the company and their customers. And so the company that was doing it better at the time, Lyft, was starting to win a lot of their business.
Yeah, absolutely. You can move fast and break things. But let's be aware of where we're moving and what we're breaking and how. All those things are important for sure. So, well, Mariah, thank you so much for being here. This has been fantastic. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.